So this is the Rhine Research Center meeting, and we have a special guest today of Charley Tart, who's joining us. Um, there are some of you who know Charley much better than I, but I know Charley not only because I've met him a couple times, but I know him mostly through what I've read and the work that he's done. I have a stack of books here. These are a bunch of books that we had in our library that Charley's written, including States of Consciousness, Transpersonal Psychology, and Open Mind, Discriminating Mind. Those are just a few I pulled off the shelf from the library just recently. But this is the first book that I read by Charley, Altered States of Consciousness, that I got when I was back in college in the 1980s, when I had no clue about really the details of parapsychology. I was just getting started. And this book, when I picked it up just in a used bookstore, it was not only fascinating, but it was written in a way that I could read it. It was really accessible. And this is what I've always loved about Charley's work, is that anything he's written, I was able to read very easily. He's an excellent communicator. Rather than going into the strict academic style, he maintains the academic rigor and at the same time is able to make it understandable. That's a real talent. One of the more recent books, I don't know if this is your most recent one, Charley, is The End of Materialism, which I also have in my library at home. These are excellent books. You know, Charley, when I first heard of Charley's work, he was doing work on altered states of on out-of-body experiences. And he was working with a woman, Mrs. Z, I believe, and set up an experiment to demonstrate whether out-of-body experiences were real or not. And interesting methodology, very, very carefully designed study to try to determine whether she was actually going out of body. And this model has been used repeatedly since that time for other sorts of experiments. Charley, the other work that I've read is related to altered states of consciousness, which I mentioned. He's also done a tremendous amount of work on getting the field of parapsychology to recognize the value of transpersonal psychology and to spread the word that we need to be considering transpersonal psychology within our work. I hope that he will discuss that a little bit with us today. And as I mentioned, his most recent work related to science and the way that our traditional materialistic sciences aren't really covering everything that we hope, all the phenomena that we're observing. Charley, I could go on and say more, and I'm sure there's other people here who could say a lot more about you. I just want to thank you for being here today, and thank you for being with us.
If I can manage to turn my camera back on, John.
We got you, Charley. There we are.
Okay, but I don't need a big picture of myself in front of me. I'd like to see other people. I can talk to myself all by myself.
We're here with you.
Okay, thank you, John. A limitation. I'm getting old and my hearing's not so good anymore. So when we get into discussions and ideas and so forth, if people could remember to talk a little bit slower and only one at a time, it'll make it easier for me to hear you. Okay? Also, my memory is beginning to slip some, but what's left is kind of interesting. So I've decided at the age of 86, going on to 87 next month, I'm not going to be an experimentalist and a formal writer and all that so much anymore. I'm going to be more of a sort of elderly gentleman who tells interesting stories. And anybody who wants the details, they're in the journal articles and books and so forth. So I'm going to start this by telling you how I got into parapsychology as a way of stimulating other thoughts and whatnot. And that'll be the theme throughout my whole talk now. I don't think we're going to solve any of the parapsychology's problems or the like, but if I can stimulate a few lines of thought that may take us somewhere, I'll be real happy. Okay, so there I am, 1955. Seems like a long time ago. I had already read a lot about parapsychology as a teenager. My motivation back then was dealing with my religion and with science. I had been raised as a Lutheran. My grandmother took me to Sunday school and then to church. And I mean, grandmothers, I mean, they're all unconditional love. So if it was good enough for her, it was good enough for me. So I just bought it, whatever it was, even though I didn't understand a lot of it. And then as I got into my teens and started thinking to myself, learning more about science and so forth, I read that you couldn't just take religion for granted if you were a pretty educated person, because there were things that didn't make sense. And indeed, science seemed to have proven that religion was all nonsense. Very, very funny situation to be in. But basically, I learned a lot about parapsychology from books, a lot of them older books, and it was all on my own. I didn't have anybody to talk to. Grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, and if there was anybody else in town who knew anything about parapsychology, I didn't know them. When I went off to college, I went to MIT and Cambridge, right across the river from Boston. And for the first time in my life, I met real parapsychologists. And I had access to journal articles and modern books and so forth. And that was a real revelation. And I'd already formed my basic conclusions then that there was no question but that there was something called psi. I mean, just so many experiments that, in a sense, there was no point in doing anything just to prove that something was happening. The question was what was happening and what could we do with it? And then I started getting even more educated. So, for example, browsing in the MIT bookstore one day, uh, it had to be mostly browsing because I was a poor student. I couldn't afford books really, but here was the clearance table where they had books for $1. And I saw one which had a funny title, The Search for Bridie Murphy. What was that, some kind of romance or something? I was a serious student of things. I didn't pay any attention. And and then I thought, oh, there's hypnosis is on the cover. Well, I knew a lot about hypnosis. This should be interesting to read. So I bought the book. I spent my $1. I thought, oh, yeah, this is pretty interesting. Okay, I wouldn't say it proves reincarnation, but it says there's some real interesting, fairly solid indications that something's going on there. And this was before the book became a bestseller. Probably that's why it was on the $1 sale table. And not too long after that, another book came out called The Scientific Search for Bridie Murphy, or something like that. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to get the perspective of people who know a lot, scientists. I mean, scientists are like gods, right? They know the truth, they're objective, and all that sort of thing. So I read the scientific, now a scientific report on the search for Bridie Murphy, and I read it, and a lot of it was accurate. It was very accurate about hypnosis. In fact, I recognized that the people writing the chapters were major national or international authorities on hypnosis. So these were, they weren't just ordinary science gods, they were big science gods. And yet I got very puzzled because they were disproving the case, showing it was all nonsense by saying that the author, Maury Bernstein, had said this, that, and the other, which were all untrue. Except something bothered me. I couldn't remember reading those untrue statements in the original book. So I went back and reread the Search for Bridie Murphy book, and sure enough, they were saying this guy, Bernstein, had said these things which were nonsense, and he hadn't said them. And this was from scientists who were supposed to be objective. Well, I'd heard that there was a lot of irrational resistance to parapsychology, but that really brought it home. And a little side story here, a couple of years later, I met the author of The Search for Bridie Murphy. spent a fair amount of time with him one summer that I'll talk about in a minute. And he told me more of the story, including the interesting fact that one of the major newspapers had wanted to serialize the book, and he didn't want them to do it because he thought they would sensationalize it. So they got very angry at him and said they would get revenge on him. And then a little while later, a woman in Chicago said, "No, actually, I was a babysitter for this woman when she was a kid, and I'm from Ireland, and I told her many things about Ireland. That's why she could say things about what Ireland was like." Except the woman who said that was the mother of the publisher who said he'd get back at Bernstein, and she never allowed herself to be interviewed by anyone else. Wow, this fight's getting pretty heavy at various places. Anyway, the other thing that really turned me on in Boston was that there was a theater in Boston across the river, the Exeter Street Theater, that often had speakers about interesting topics in. And I heard J.B. Rhine talk a number of times. Eileen Garrett came and talked. A number of parapsychology, real parapsychologists, and gosh, they were right there. Now, I'm the kind of student any teacher would like in their class because I usually sit in the front row and I look interested because I am interested and I ask interesting questions which say I obviously know something and care something about what they're talking about. So I got invited to the private tea for the speakers afterwards and really got to know some of these people better. Eileen Garrett, after she was talking to me, said, "You know, we've helped support some research on this doctor who's doing research with Faraday cages or some sort of electronic thing that he says enhances ESP greatly." Well, I was going to be an electrical engineer, and what, an electrical method that could enhance ESP? That was very interesting because I'd already realized that the primary problem, well, I don't want to say a primary problem for parapsychology was that the results were statistically significant, but usually practically trivial. You know, instead of 50-50 guessing task, instead of guessing it right, if somebody got 50.5% but kept it up over a lot of runs, that could get great statistical odds, but it meant they were guessing more than 99% of the time. From my experience as a radio amateur trying to do communications with very high noise levels and inferior equipment and all that, so yeah, that signal to noise ratio in parapsychology leaves an awful lot to be desired. But if psi could be manifested more strongly, then you could do the what's it correlated with, what affects it, and so forth. So I was curious enough that I got in touch with this man, this doctor she suggested, Andrea Puharich, who had his own private research foundation up in Maine, and I got a summer job with him. I thought, oh boy, I'm going to get some practical experience with parapsychological research. And I got paid $1 an hour, you know, so that was real money back then. I think it was minimum wage, which was better than any other job I'd had. It was a very fascinating summer. That's where I met Maury Bernstein and heard more about the search for Bridie Murphy and all that. And I saw the kind of experiments he was doing with Faraday cages. And as I realized later, they didn't really quite make sense in terms of the strict electrical understanding of what Faraday cages did. If you're in a metal box or even a screen box surrounding you, it cuts down radio waves getting to the inside. Why that should help ESP, I don't know. The best I could ever do was it might increase, maybe by being in an environment where there's radio waves impinging on us all the time, it creates some kind of noise in the brain. And although psi is not electromagnetic, if the instrument that picks it up, whatever part of the brain that is Maybe that would do it. I don't know. But basically, I thought his findings were correct. You know, they weren't as sophisticated as could be. They were new things, exploring what can happen, not if something happened, let's redo it 100 different times or something. It was moving on ahead for things. So one of the strangest things in my career in parapsychology is that over the last 50 or 60 years I've been doing this, I've often tried to get people interested in Kuharik's work. I once carried out a replication of it, although at much lower level of amount of psi. He had pre-selected people who showed psychic abilities. I had the ordinary college student, but I showed a difference between two differences of Faraday cages in their electrical connections that made a difference in the amount of psi that people could show. So at the same time, well, after that, in my early career, when I was very much involved in dream research, that was a hot new topic. And when I went to yearly meetings of people who were into sleep and dream research, when people reported something new, everybody tried to confirm it and then extend it and so forth. So obviously, this would happen in parapsychology. By and large, no, nobody really paid much attention. Some of my students back at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology have done a study on it, and I've been told the research are coming. It's only been 10 or 15 years since the end of the experiment, I think, but I'm looking forward to it. But again, it raises the question, why not? And I'll throw something else in now, forgetting this chronological order. I went to parapsychological association conventions for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, something like that. And I noticed a strange phenomenon. When somebody would present the results of an experiment where they got results statistically significant at the 0.05 or 0.01 level, unless there was a major methodological problem, that was generally accepted as a useful finding. But on the rare occasions when somebody did an ESP study and showed really strong results, the criticism for possible flaws was much more intense than when you got trivial amounts of ESP, even if it was statistically significant. What's the funny thing here? Over the years, it led me to think, based on observations of my own psychology, that I think we're afraid of ESP. And the crazy thing is, I sometimes think I'm the only parapsychologist I've ever met who's actually admitted that sometimes I've felt afraid of ESP. It's nobody else, it's just me. Maybe. And I've written stuff on this and so forth, which brings me back to another point to throw in this basket of stimulations, as it were. Parapsychology suffers from what they've called the Stockholm Syndrome. Patty Hearst is kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army and kept a prisoner a long time. And then she's holding one of the guns in one of their bank robberies to get more money. She's identified with, bought into the worldview of this rebel group. I think there are ways in which we've overly bought into a materialistic view of science, the Stockholm Syndrome. I forget the original genesis of the term Stockholm Syndrome. Somebody captured in Stockholm, I guess. And we're trying so hard to look like the common image of science. I'm a scientist. I have no biases. I'm completely objective. I'm really brilliant. And I'm just doing things to make sure there's no possible ways there could be the slightest flaw in anything I do. And yeah, And of course, I don't count, you know. Water is made up of two hydrogen to one oxygen molecules, no matter who does the experiment to find that out. We're trying to create a parapsychology experiment that's independent of the experimenter. And I've decided that that's one of our major flaws. The experimenter is always, except maybe in rare instances, part of the experiment. And what the experimenter wants to do, uh, biases that may be unconscious as well as conscious, may be doing stuff, like we have some experimenters who never find a significant result, even though they use the same external procedures as other ones who routinely get significant results. The experimenter matters. We've got to admit that. It makes the research much harder. You know, I think, for instance, we need to somehow be able to monitor the movements of the unconscious mind of the experimenter minute by minute, if not second by second, during an experiment, and probably in the build up to the experiment, and maybe even afterwards, if you talk about post-cognition and all that, or precognition. I incidentally accept the evidence that precognition is real, but it absolutely makes no sense at all to me. So I try not to think about it too much. Anyway, I've talked maybe longer than I was going to do to start things off, but this is a little glimpse of where I started and where I went. Well, I went all over the place. My blessing or my curse is I'm curious about so many different things. So, like maybe I should have devoted my whole entire life to replicating Puharich stuff and finding out the best way to electrically charge a Faraday cage to get, but there were so many other interesting things to do too. But I did manage to build a Faraday cage as part of the dream studies I used to do. Anyway, I'd like to hear from you guys now. And John, can you change this so I can see more of the people here? Because, some of you folks I know personally, some of you I know by name, but not really personally. And it's much better if I can actually see you. So what are you
Well,
thinking so far? Where
well,
are we
Charlie,
going?
we were really happy to be able to see you while you introduced these topics. And I have to tell you, hey, you're not the only one who's afraid of psi and admits it. There are people in
Thank
this
you,
room
John.
who I've watched perform psi during an experiment, and they won't admit it. um, so this happens quite often, and I think it happens a lot within the field. And so many different topics you talked about. So I'm gonna, I'm sure some of you guys have some comments, or questions. Please jump in.
Let me respond to that a minute, John. I know you're going to ask me about transpersonal psychology, but that's just another example of how we have to be studying the experimenter. And that, I think, at this stage of our knowledge, and maybe forever, includes lots and lots of self-study. How do I feel? And how come I think I feel like this, but I have a funny ache in my stomach at the same time or something? We've got to monitor ourselves and see how that correlates with what goes on in our experiments. Anyway.
No, since you brought that up, I'm going to just take one more minute since I am kind of hosting the meeting. And I'm going to tell a quick story of my own related to this. A few years ago, I had designed a study and I'd gotten,
Don't talk too fast, John.
okay, I'll slow down for you.
Thank you. I know you're excited. That's good.
I am. I am excited. I designed a study to test how emotions might affect electronic equipment. And my theory was that unconsciously we were having impacts on networks and on computer systems. And I wanted to set up a computer system to monitor errors within the system and then make people anxious around the computer.
Oh, cool.
So this is the study that I was setting up, and I had just gotten my funding, and I was like, okay, I have to get my computers. I ordered my computers. They came. One of the computers, I was so excited that I had these new computers. One of the computers, I could not get it to turn on. No matter what I did, it was brand new out of the box. I fought with this computer for a full day, contacted tech support, did everything they asked me to do. Nothing was working. Eventually, I gave up and I said, well, I'm going to have to send it back and get a new one. At that point, I relaxed. I said, I'm going to try it one more time. With tech support on the line, I pushed the button, the computer started right up, and I haven't had a problem with it since. This is exactly observing my own experiences before the experiment had even been set up and starting, helped to inform me on how the experiment should be conducted. And I think this is a real important part of what we need to do within the field is continue to recognize we are part of the study.
Oh, that was wonderful, John, because I like to interpret that as unconscious John was saying, hey, conscious John up there, you're onto something here. I'm going to show you.
Yes, and I'm going to beat you in the head with it until you notice.
Okay.
Other thoughts?
I have a question. In fact, I think I may have just had my own experience of your experiment, John, because I had a 30-minute odyssey trying to get into this meeting, but I'm finally here with John's help. Dr. Tart, I've been reading your book, Secrets of the Soul, and other things that you've written. And I had a question about some of your work with hypnosis. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the degree to which hypnosis is a distinct altered state of consciousness versus a social role that people learn how to perform. And it seems to me that a particularly strong piece of evidence for it being a distinct altered state of consciousness would be if it's possible to induce global amnesia, like many hypnotists claim that they're able to perform with their subjects, as opposed to just, reciting some words and saying, now you're going to have trouble remembering all those words. That I could see just being the nocebo effect. But if you're able to induce global amnesia so the person can't remember anything that happened during the hypnosis session, that would be pretty strong evidence for a fundamentally altered state of consciousness. Do you, in your experience, have you seen evidence for the ability to induce global amnesia in a consistent way, or do you have other strong evidence for it being a distinct, fundamentally different state of consciousness?
Well, I'd say both the point of views you mentioned are correct.
Mhm.
For some people, hypnosis is a social role that they might play very consciously. There's really no change to speak of their consciousness. They're just picking up cues as to how they should behave and do it. And for others, it's a social role, but they are get so identified with the role that it is an altered state, except we don't know enough yet to recognize, to have a distinct boundary between ordinary consciousness and an altered state gets real touched. So for instance, right now, it is possible to dream about being at a Zoom conference, hearing somebody talk. Is anybody here dreaming? Can I see some hands? Is anybody unsure about it? I mean, you could dream about this.
Charlie, listening to your talk, I feel like I must be dreaming.
Well, just so it doesn't be a nightmare. Okay, Ronald Shore's article on 3 dimensions of hypnotic depth? I think I reprinted it in my Altered States of Consciousness book. Okay, I think it's the best analysis I've seen except let me say I'm 40 years of not following the hypnosis literature very closely anymore. But one of my students keeps me in mind if there's any real breakthrough in understanding. Shore said these three dimensions of hypnotic depth. One is this social role taking and the degree to which it becomes identified with. Just like, if somebody's attacking you and become an angry person, well, all sorts of things change in you, and it happens so fast, and we do that kind of thing with emotions so often, we don't recognize their altered states. We just think they're part of ordinary. Okay, so there was the social dimension. For a second one, there was what he called I can't think of his name for it, but basically he talked about in a psychoanalytic way that relationships with your parents when you were a young child and they were like gods, you went into that sort of transference sort of role. I mean, you hurt yourself and mommy said it won't really hurt now and it stopped hurting. Whoa, that's powerful stuff. His third dimension was what he called an actual trance dimension. For some people, there really is an altered state of consciousness. They can all look the same from the outside in terms of what they can do for the most part. Now, when you talk about inducing a global amnesia, I say there's no doubt about it. We induced it regularly in the years I spent in Hilgard's hypnosis research lab, but we induced it for 15 or 20 minutes. If it was going to be a really global amnesia, I would like to be following up people like that a day later, a month later, a year later, and so forth, because maybe that was just a kind of role playing at that point rather than a genuine amnesia. I mean, you're asking a question that's really a very sophisticated question. And I don't think we have the answer yet because, in terms of experimental stuff, they're always limited to an hour or two at the most.
Thank you.
So, Graham,
Yeah.
did you have any thoughts on this? Because I know, Graham, you often talk about hypnosis and whether it's really an altered state or not. I didn't know if
Well,
you
yeah, I don't tend to consider it an altered state. The first ones he's describing, the first stages seem to be pretty well verifiable. The third stage, where it goes into an actual altered state, I'm not sure I really see the evidence for it. I will admit that I am biased about this because I've had several professional hypnotists who claim they can hypnotize anybody, try to hypnotize me. And it does, I try to cooperate, but it simply doesn't happen.
I have the problem.
Huh?
I have the same problem. It's been
Yeah.
very hard for anybody to hypnotize me.
I have
I'm
never been, and there was some years where I was trying it fairly frequently because I wanted to experience it.
Yeah.
And I never could get there.
Yeah, I know. I wanted the same thing. I wanted to experience this marvelous change for myself. To me, dreams have always been an altered state. Okay.
I agree with that.
And and once in a while, I've had a lucid dream where I'm still in the dream world, but my consciousness is now much more like my ordinary waking consciousness. I know I'm dreaming. I remember one I had about a year ago where I found myself in my house and I wasn't really clearly lucid, but I was enough to know I think this is a dream. And I wonder how good a reproduction of my actual house it is. So I was wandering around saying, okay, the furniture's in the right place here in the dining room. I think this stuff is on the cabinet there. And, oh, there's an interesting mirror in the corner. I wonder, a big person-sized mirror. I wonder what would happen if I stepped through that mirror. I stepped through the mirror. I was in my house again, except I could tell this was not quite the same reproduction of my house. Although I looked around and searched once again, and there was a mirror still in it. And I thought about stepping through the mirror again for a second time, but I thought, I'm not so sure where this is going to take me. Well, this was clearly an altered state. Or take another example, my friend Bob Monroe, he of the many out of the body experiences. I asked him once, did he ever have lucid dreams? And he said, yeah, he's had dreams where his consciousness gets clearer and he knows that he's in a dream. And I said, how do you distinguish this from feeling that you're actually out of the body? And he thought for a while about it and said, well, if it's a dream, I can make things happen just by willing them. If I want the object on that table to float over to me, no sweat. But if I'm in one of these out of the body places that feels like a real location to me, that stuff doesn't work. I've got to figure out what the laws are governing things there and act in accordance with them. Now, you could say, well, the dream in the first place is just a simulation, and a lucid dream is another simulation, and a dream within a dream is another simulation. Well, maybe, but I say, why not explore these things? One of the implicit hypotheses messing up all our research is, well, I don't have a good name for it yet, but it's sort of like the infinitely capable simulation device. That's the belief that something in our neural circuits or in our mental circuits, if you want to make the distinction, something in them can create another environment, and it feels real when you're in it. And there's no limitations on what it can do. So no matter what people's experience is, you can always dismiss it as just imagination. Well, that's handy for upholding your belief that imagination is not very useful or something, and the world is just like we think it is. But I think a mapping of particular kinds of altered states experiences to find out especially what can't happen in them might eventually give us some distinctive markers that say, okay, now this person is in altered state number 7 and not in altered state number 8 or something like that. It's going to take a long time to do this kind of surveying, but yeah. And of course, everybody wants a physiological mark to say when somebody's hypnotized. I don't think they've got it yet. There's
No, I don't either.
changes happen, but they haven't got it yet. And I'm
So,
not sure they'll ever get it because, again, I think Shore's 3 different kinds of hypnosis that all look the same from the outside is quite brilliant. And maybe it's actually 4 or 5, and he just didn't distinguish them all yet. Good question.
so we've been hearing from 2 guys who said that they've never really had much success with hypnosis. I've used hypnosis quite a bit, but I know, Sally, would you like to talk about your experiences with hypnosis?
Yeah, yes, I would, because I have the answer to when to how you make it real. I've never used it much before or after, but when I was pregnant with I can remember one of my children, I went to the man who had taught hypnosis to my father, to his
Ellie, could you go slightly slower because of my hard of
Yes,
hearing? I'm missing a few words.
Yeah, I'm saying that I found my own answer to how to be hypnotized. It was when I was going to have a child. I did have a child, and the man who was my physician was using hypnosis for delivery of babies. And he came at it because he had taught my father, I think, hypnosis way back in the early days. He had taught him how to use it. And in fact, JB was very successful, not with me particularly, but with other Dukes, with Duke students. He could have gone into professional work with hypnosis because in those days, he was so successful at it. Now, there weren't many other people and there was no competition. But back to my story. So, okay, the baby is coming, the delivery is there. The doctor is very interested in me. Now, he was a personal friend already, like my father's friend. So he was giving me good attention, good treatment, all the best. Okay, if you're having a baby, and I guess that Graham hasn't tried this, or Charley have not tried having a baby, but if you're in childbirth, it is so painful that when somebody is trying to help you, if they said, eat this magic apple, it would be the best apple in the world if it helped. And somehow it helped me enough that I was able to deliver this child with minimal pain. So the price, or not the price, the profit, or what you get from it really counted. Now, maybe soldiers in the battlefield would come about the same thing. If somebody is hypnotizing them and telling them it doesn't hurt, it probably helps somewhat, but it sure helped to me. So I think you just haven't had the kind of reward or punishment for not making it work for you.
Yes, thank you, Sally. That's very good. And
Good.
John illustrates something else about what transpersonal psychology is about. It's about taking people's descriptions of their experiences seriously, not deciding they can't be about something real, but finding what they can do, what they can't do, and whatnot. Hypnosis does that for some people. I've that's one of the reasons I like to be hypnotized. I don't like pain. It would be nice if I could say 1, 2, 3, no pain. Ah, there it is. I'm pretty good with autogenic trainings in terms of just relaxation, but none of the major hypnotic effects work with me.
And Sally, it
Yeah,
sounds
same
like
here, same here.
it sounds like
Same
from your
here.
description, it was related to there was a need.
Need.
And when we do research on healing, it's Oscar Estebani, who worked with Bernard Grad, talked about the fact that there needs to be something that needs to be healed, rather than trying to make something better that was already healthy. If something had a need to be healed, that this would make it more effective. And that's kind of what Bill Bankston works on, this same model right now. So it seems like this seems to be a thread that goes through our some of our research now. I don't know if that relates to transpersonal issues, Charley. Is that...
Well, let me say more about it then, because I've just hinted at some of it. Okay, some people have an experience that changes their life totally after a 5-minute experience, and they say the experience was about being in a different way of existing, or meeting an entity that was divine in some way, that changed everything in their life. If the experiencer is a Christian, they'll probably say that was Jesus. If they're Jewish, they'll probably say it was an angel. If they're an atheist, they'll fall back into the visiting anthropologist role and say a person who was very impressive and whatnot. Those experiences are incredibly important when they happen to people. And now I'm trying not to confuse them with simply strongly emotional experiences, but which you're in your ordinary state of consciousness. Okay, that there's no doubt that you can influence people by eliciting various kinds of ordinary emotions, but the transpersonal ones, people say it's very, very different. We hear a lot more about transpersonal experiences now because resuscitation techniques are so much better. And so many people who've been very close to death come back with one kind of experience of this total kind of change. This is not something we can experiment on very well. I mean, I can imagine these objective, uninvolved scientists who learn to take people so close to death they die for a couple of minutes and they bring them back just to see what happens. But getting a little unethical and too risky. The near part in the near-death experience is tricky. It happens in nature, so what can we learn from that? What I've learned from studying near-death experiences, and I knew about these kinds of things long before they became popular, because you can run across them in the old psychical research literature a lot. Okay? But once we started getting a lot of experiences, what amazed me was major similarities in the experience among people with very different backgrounds and beliefs. And if this was just a projection of their subjective self, I would think, Christians would always say they met Jesus. They'd never say they met a being of light. They'd say it was Jesus or something. But that kind of coherence across experiences makes me want to say, are they pointing at something real? Is it real only in some kind of psychological sense, or is it in a sense more than that? Bob Monroe, did I write an article on this or just give a talk on it at a P? I don't know. But Bob Monroe had several experiences of going to a place that he thought was a real reality, and he thought was probably a physical reality, but not around here, because certain things were quite different from it. And he had a consistent way of getting there. He had to roll over in his physical body and go out through his head and feel for a wall behind his head in this body experience. And there was a hole in it, and pulled himself through the hole. And then he was in this other place. That's a strange one, but that's the way he described it. And then he found these consistent characteristics there that said, this is not here, but it's sort of like here in some ways. Like they had railroads, they had cars, but they had cars that were much wider than they were long. That's weird, and that's lousy engineering. That's going to mess up your stability a lot. He eventually stopped going there because it felt after a while as if he automatically merged with some person who lived there, and he was messing that person up. Because then that person would run into a situation where this was anymore, and Bob couldn't fake it. Yeah, maybe Bob was totally crazy. I'm sure a lot of people would say he was, but I think he was a very solid and honest person, trying his best to report things. But is that place he went to an actual place somewhere? Or is it, let's say, an actual physical place? Or is it an actual spiritual, psychic, non-physical, I don't know the word for it, place that nevertheless other people could go there and they would find the same thing when they didn't know what they were supposed to expect? Okay, if you tell people what these distinguishing marks are, then you can imagine fantasy taking things over and whatnot. Transpersonal psychology, then, in one sense, is to investigate these overwhelming experiences, and it could stay within a materialistic framework and just say they're good for people who are unhappy or have psychological problems. So let's learn to induce them, even if they're just a fantasy. We need more therapies that are helpful, but maybe there's something real. I'd like to know.
You're talking about these people going into an altered state. You're talking about Bob Monroe going into an altered state and traveling to another location. And we often hear people talking about within their dreams that they travel to the same place repeatedly in their dreams, to the point that they start to wonder, is it a real place or not? And in shamanic culture, and Jack, I don't know if you're with us or not, but in shamanic culture, they talk about there's traveling in shamanic culture where multiple people will travel together and sometimes actually encounter the same objects in this traveling space that they're working on, that they're in together. I don't know if this relates to any of the research that you did on altered states, if you encountered that in other sorts of altered state research.
That's very interesting, John, because I am not sure I've ever met anyone else who said they've heard of or experienced going to the same place repeatedly in their dreams.
Mhm.
One of the reasons it's especially interesting to me is that when I was a kid, okay, and I think I'm roughly talking about between the ages of, I don't know, 10 and 18 or something like that, once a year or so, I would find myself on a river and take a little canoe trip and pull in a little place downstream and go up the hill to this cabin that was up there and meet these people whom I'd met before and say, "Hi, how have you been since I was last here?" and the like, and then go back and come back to this place that we live in that we believe is real, which I believe is real 99.9999% of the time, but I don't know. Now, it's also interesting, my health is not good, okay? The last time I talked to my doctor about what do you think my life expectancy is given the various things I have, she thought, oh, maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 years, but with hospitalizations in between. I hope I can prove her wrong because I'm trying to write 2 more books, but uh, I am in one sense, I'm reconciled to dying. I've had a very interesting life. It's been quite amazing. And I prefer to this is okay. I don't say this as a scientist, okay? I mean, I'm one of these rare scientists who know a lot about the evidence for personal survival and think the evidence is pretty good, but it's kind of tricky to interpret it all, okay? But for myself personally, when I'm dying, I'm going to assume that I'm going to be traveling rather than blacking out, and that something interesting is going to happen on the other side. Now, I I hold this belief as a working hypothesis because I think it makes life and my health more bearable. I mean, if I'm going to go on a trip, I'm going to complain less about my pain than if I think I've lost it all now and whatnot. And of course, there's the safety factor that if I'm wrong, and when the material brain dies, I'm gone, I will never be embarrassed for having had a belief that wasn't completely true.
The
I'm
variant of
reminded of,
Pascal's wager.
I'm reminded of Eileen Garrett once when I think it was Larry LeShan asked her what she made of being a medium after all these years. And she said something like, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I believe it's just what it seems to be. I go into a trance and spirits channel through me. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I think the psychologists are right. My unconscious mind is creating this stuff and throwing in some ESP and so forth. And Sunday, I try not to think the hell about it. I thought that was a very sensible attitude.
I can certainly give you an example of someone who has visited the same place in dreams many
Yes,
times
Greg.
because I do. I have some lucid dreamings. I can't call them up on demand, but I have a key in my
Good.
dreams that tells me this is a dream.
Yeah.
It's always the same key. I'm driving in my car and I suddenly can't see through the windshield. And uh, if that happens, I know this is a dream. And all I have to do is will the car to come to a safe stop. And I can get out of it and then I can go anywhere I want and do anything I want. And there's several places that I've been to dozens of times that are the same place in the dream structure.
Oh,
Often the same people are there in the dream structure.
now, let me ask you to split yourself into 2 people for the moment.
Sure.
The scientist
I do that
and
all the time.
you personally. As a scientist, what do you think about the reality of that place? And as an actual living person, what do you think about that place?
As a scientist, I think I'm making it up.
Yeah.
That does, I have no evidence otherwise, right? But it's
Okay.
the places, see, to emotional me, which is how I often describe that split, emotional me and intellectual me.
Right.
To emotional me, they seem very real. And the
Mhm.
people I commonly see there seem like very real people. They're not any real people I meet in the real world or know in the real world. But I've seen them in the dreams quite a number of times.
Mhm. Sounds good to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fun when it
Yeah.
happens.
I take the same split that I ask you to take. When I'm being firmly in my scientist role, I say, well, there's some evidence, but the hypothesis that my unconscious is presenting me with a made up thing is a pretty good hypothesis.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, some other part of me says, I experienced this. I mean, my experience is the ultimate thing I have to go by in some sense.
I experience these places as veridically as I'm experiencing sitting in my office at this Zoom meeting right now.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, all the senses. One of them is in uh, something like a state fair pavilion place, and there's straw on the ground, and I can smell it in the dream.
Say that again. I didn't quite follow that.
It's in a state fair or county fair type pavilion, and there's straw on the ground, right?
Snow on the ground. Okay.
Right, and I can smell it in
Ah.
the dream, and often know I'm close to it by the smell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know there's a quite distinct smell to a snow-covered area.
Yep,
And smell, I think, is a very rare experience in dreams of any sort.
it is for me. It is for me. That's one of the few that I could
Yeah.
cite of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe
I
we should ask how many people here have had that experience.
of lucid dreams
Well, no,
or
of Graham's smell. I've never heard of it before. Jack has.
Yeah.
So that's one common.
I'm not sure
When I think
that
about,
dreams or the
sitting-
smell of snow.
Snow.
The smell of snow. Okay. You live too far south. The snow.
It was a small error. It wasn't snow. It was straw.
Oh.
The floors were covered with straw to keep down the mud and so on.
Uh-huh.
like in a stable.
Yeah, like in a stable.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's distinct too. Yeah. I, getting to know you, Graham, I'm hoping you're writing a book about your lucid dream life. I think it sounds very interesting.
I haven't been, but maybe I should.
Yeah. Yeah. For instance, when I was still in my teenage years, I came across the books on astral projections by Muldoon and Carrington. And I liked Sylvan Muldoon. I thought, the tone of this guy is this, that he's a straightforward, honest person trying to accurately describe what happened, not somebody with a theoretical axe to ground or a religion to push or something. And that gave me a strong impression. Yeah. And finding other people like Bob Monroe and the like who can give good reports on what they're doing. I think we can get at that reality.
Since we're talking about dreams, I have a question about dream content. There is, a widespread perception that basically everything that occurs in a dream has a symbolic meaning. But from a scientific perspective, I haven't found any evidence that would validate that. And so I was curious, Dr. Tart, what your view would be on how much dream content is genuinely symbolic or, as opposed to just random, and how we might know that it has symbolic content and why our subconscious would talk to us in symbols instead of straightforward. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
My thoughts would be much clearer if my dream production self had a code book and just gave me a copy of it.
Mhm.
Okay. Uh, once in a while, a dream has given me a perspective on ordinary waking life. Most of the time, I just go off and have interesting adventures in other worlds, and whatnot. But let's take this for dream. Now, how do I want to say this? Okay, let's take it from a psychoanalytic view, which is the biggest school that says yes, these dreams have meaning even if they're disguised. And the proof of that, put proof in quotes because we can argue about how much it actually proves, is that it seems to help therapy along. And I think, okay, that's probably true. But how much would it help therapy along if you said, tell me in detail about what you had for breakfast this morning? How much of the progress in therapy comes from the fact that an intelligent, caring person is giving you a lot of attention and cares for you? That's a constant thing in therapy, and that could account for all sorts of things. So I don't know. I've met some people over the years who say they have pretty clear symbols that repeat. Okay, in a sense, they know some of their code book. They can decode the dreams. I don't think most people are like that. I don't know actually. I don't think anybody's ever asked that question in a widespread survey of how many people have consistent codes that way. It would be nice if it did. Um, I I wonder about it once in a while. I think, gee, I go to sleep and this whole world is created and things happen. And I didn't call up all that equipment to fill in the scenery or to devise a plot and bring in some actors to do certain roles. It just happened. Maybe that unconscious, there's something to it. And maybe just speaking of the unconscious as it's just a part of our physical brain is only partially true. Maybe there is some spiritual level that sometimes deliberately puts something through to influence our dream content. Or maybe sometimes just what goes on some spiritual level just has a lot of leakage and some of it goes down into our dreams. And that's why it doesn't make too much sense for it. I think what you ask is researchable. But what would probably come out was we'd find a few people who have a good code book. And then it would be interesting to find out what makes those people have that. Could you train people to have that? Or bringing it back to hypnosis, it would be a very interesting experiment to give people post-hypnotic suggestions to develop a code book. My first research in graduate school was in using post-hypnotic suggestion to influence the content of dreams that I would pick up from waking people from stage 1 rapid eye movements later in the night. And I was doing that because I thought the psychoanalytic truth that seemed to be very strongly believed in, that immediate day residue almost never appeared in a dream the next day, maybe many days later in disguise form. And I said, no, that seems overgeneralization to me. So I picked some people who could go into a reasonably deep hypnotic state and my criteria for that was that a number of classical hypnotic effects could be experienced with them, including deliberate amnesia, so that after I brought them back to waking, they did not remember what was going on until I told them they could. So I would get somebody with the electrodes on prepared to spend the night in the laboratory, and I would hypnotize them, and then I had a script prepared. And in the script, I had a short story with at least 8 or 10 descriptive, distinct elements in it, and things that did not appear often in dreams. I don't remember whether I had Hall and Van de Castle's book on the frequency of various things in dream yet, or whether I just used my own experience. I don't know. Anyway, I would suggest to them, you will dream about this tonight. And when you wake now, you'll forget that I gave you this suggestion, and you'll have a good night's sleep. So I'd bring them out of hypnosis, they'd go to sleep. I would wake them 4 to 5, 6 times maybe during the night to ask them, what did you dream? And I found in almost every dream they reported at least half, if not 75% or more, of these distinctive elements appearing in the dream. Then they may be arranged in a different order. The theme may have been somewhat changed, but they got all these specific things in there. So clearly it was possible, if you think of hypnosis as going to the unconscious, which I did at the time, so here's my beliefs coming into it. The unconscious can cooperate and produce dreams that way. My long-term goal was I was basically trying to create a two-way radio into dreams. I later did a study showing that I could give post-hypnotic suggestions where people sleep talked more frequently than they did spontaneously. And I was hoping to get to the point where I could train these people. Again, they were just selected to be hypnotizable this way. And I'd see a stage 1 dream happening. I could say, okay, Jimmy, I would like you to now dream about getting in a small airplane. Can you do that? And to, yeah, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, okay, I've got a hangar over here. I'll bring, yes, there's an airplane. I thought, if you could get two-way communication into that altered state while it's happening, what interesting things you could do. I got too interested in too many other things. Some of the original research money ran out before I got there to actually trying the two-way radio part of it. And then my Altered States book alerted people to the reality of lucid dreams, and all sorts of people started realizing, oh, that's what happened to me. That's what that interesting thing was. And so lucid dreams took off on their own, but there's no two-way radio with lucid dreams. You can't speak to the dreamer while they're actually in the stage 1 dream state. That would be very, very fascinating.
That really would be fascinating if you could do that, yes.
I know that during the Stargate program, there was some attempts to communicate with individuals while they were in a dream state. And they did it, I believe, through like a kind of goggles that they would show a red light to communicate some kind of signal to the dreamer. I know that Greg Seward was part of that research project, but he had a problem with the goggles giving him headaches.
There
Stephen
does be opportunities.
English psychologist came up with that technique,
Mhm.
that the flashing red light might get into the dream and serve as a cue that this is a dream, try to become lucid. I don't know how well the Monroe stuff worked. You know?
There is an opportunity for two-way communication with psychedelics that is currently being investigated and is in fact direct two-way communication to another plane of reality, which is very similar to a dreaming plane. Particularly DMT has an awful lot in common with the dream state, and entity encounters are often described. And there are labs set up now where they plan to do two-way communication, intravenous DMT, in order to keep somebody in that state for more than just a few minutes, because it metabolizes so quickly that it's 5 minutes. But there are people who are seeing identical things and interacting with in ways that are so incredibly similar and unbelievably hyper real that it does appear to be another plane of existence with easy access, and
Have you
very
got a
much like dreams.
Have you got a reference on that, Russell?
I studied dreams for many years. I wrote a dissertation on the function of dreams, and wrote about lucid dreaming also. Because of your work, Charles Tart, Dr. Tart, you influenced me quite a bit. And
Wait.
what I have found is, like, I believe at this point that there is a clear overlap between dream states and psychedelic states. And the reason for that is because of who we meet when we are there. And it is a real place. I'm sorry, Graham, were you asking something from
Yes,
me?
I was asking if you have a reference.
The
I'm not
reason to
familiar
give-
with this.
You
On the
spoke
DMT.
for the reason. Tell me the reason they're like.
So let me just. Graham was asking Russell, do you have a reference?
Well, I'm not sure to what,
And
but I'll
if you do, you can put it in the chat. And Charlie was asking, hey, why do you think that psychedelics and dream states are alike? Am I right, Charlie?
Let me just ask, Christina Hardy has written a two-part article recently that is fantastic regarding synchronicity. One of the best pieces I've ever come across in terms of the physics of it. She's a physicist. It just came out recently, her second part. So that is a place to go if you want to see a relationship between synchronicity and physics and the entities that may in fact be behind them. The other question of how is it similar, the dream state and the DMT state?
Yeah.
Was that they're both places, they're both real. They're both created by an intelligence which is way beyond ours, the experiences. They're both incredibly visual, although DMT is the most visual thing I have ever experienced. Other than that, the main thing I would say is that the presence, the absolute certainty of an intelligence beyond human is astounding. And it will change your life. I'm not recommending, unless you really want your life changed. Because in any case, that's so. But the relationship between dreaming and other altered states is very clear to me, and mostly because of who inhabits them, and the reality of the space, and the fact that it's not normal consciousness.
Yes. Thank you for the warning. Do not try this at home. I understand what you're talking about. Okay. My knowledge of psychedelics is now probably 50 years out of date, or basically sound. I don't know which, but I certainly haven't followed literature on it anymore. But I certainly know that you can talk to people in a psychedelic state. I was in experiments that a psychiatrist carried out with LSD and psilocybin, and there were many tests being done at that time. And I remember being asked questions about what was going on, or one of the most amusing times, and the psychiatrist was interested in people saying they could see all these new shades of color that they can't ordinarily see. So he had a little test that he would give us when we were high. And I think of it as the bottle cap test. There were something like 100 different little bottle caps, each with a slightly different color on the top. And in your ordinary state, it would be hard to put these in the right spectral order because the differences were very tiny. So I remember taking the test one time, and I was having a hard time finding the match to fit where I wanted it to go. So my mind cooperated by hallucinating the matching color onto the bottle cap I had in my hand. So I carried out the instructions of me, fitted it into the next thing in the spectrum, but I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do.
It was still magical.
It was very high. Yeah. As to whether it's an outside intelligence, I've been working at the much more basic level that just tells us there's good reason to look in these directions.
Well, my experience has been that there is incredible a flow of symbolic. It's not geometric, the visual stuff. It's not mandalas or patterns. It is an explosion of symbolic language in a way that is unbelievably beautiful, completely incomprehensible, very fast, comes directly at you, and is clearly intelligent. That's, and it's life-changing if you want to go there. And it's 5 minutes. That's the thing, it's 5 minutes. You don't need a hit of LSD and 12 hours later, you're on the floor trying to figure out. It's 5 minutes there and back. And it's endogenous. We create it in our own brain.
Is that some of the places that John Lilly used to go in his explorations with DMT? Oh yeah.
Lilly-
John was a good old friend, except he would tease me terribly for being so square.
Um,
Yeah.
Dr.
Sally?
Tart, I was wondering about something. The dream studies at Maimonides showed positive results. And would you consider the communication of, say, an agent with somebody dreaming being a form of communication?
Yes, yes.
Because
Uh,
that was shown over and over again.
Yeah. Oh no, those were very impressive studies. I really liked them. And seeing it as a form of communication is a way that makes sense to us. Now,
Yes.
maybe from some higher dimensional level, it's merely a shift in the filing cabinet of the cosmos or something. I don't know. But yeah, and that brings back to my interest in this of parapsychological stuff and religion. Religion is considered nonsense because, like, if you're praying, what you're doing is expelling hot air into the room you're in, but that's the end of it unless somebody's there listening to you. Your prayer doesn't go anywhere, much less to some other being. Well, but with all our stuff on ESP, we know your intentions, your thoughts can, as it were, go somewhere and affect somebody else. Maybe that's a model that praying can induce ESP sometimes. And who's on the other end? What's on the other end? That's you for you younger folks to figure that out. I'm not going to live long enough to get that part of it, unless I figure it out after I die. I don't know, but
You'll
I
know
don't know.
before we do it if you die
I'm not
before
sure.
we get there, right?
I'm not sure.
I had another question related to the work that you had done on learning. Because I don't remember whether it was a chapter in a book, a monograph, but you wrote fairly extensively about parapsychology and the ability of people to learn
Yeah.
techniques. Do you have any references on that you could recommend?
Oh, yeah. There's a book on the first major experiment that I did called Learning to Use ESP. The University of Chicago Press published it, to my great amazement, and they subjected it to a much deeper review than the average journal article gets. So I felt, the establishment had given me tremendous recognition there. And there are several journal articles, mainly in the ASPR journal, that in which I talked more about the internal dynamics of it. But the basic idea was that if you have some psi ability, you don't know how to engage it in a flawless way. Every time I clench my left fist, I'm now telepathic. Uh, if only it were that easy. Maybe sometimes when I do it, things happen. Sometimes, but if you could give people immediate feedback on what's successful and not successful, you could slowly begin to realize that when I feel this way, I have a good chance of my impressions being right. But when I feel that way, I'm always wrong. I should say, sorry, I pass on this. So think of it in the typical multiple choice guessing test, the card guessing test, which were always done with no scoring of it, no feedback until the end, because we didn't have the statistics to handle what would happen if you got feedback during the actual guessing. So all the classical tests were done with no feedback. But from what I learned in the basic psychology class that I was required to take and didn't really want to take because I was doing my dream studies and awake all night monitoring the equipment. And then I had this 8 o'clock class on learning theory. What I learned was when you give lots of practice with no feedback, that's an extinction paradigm. That's how you get rid of a talent. And sure enough, people talk about the decline effect as a characteristic of ESP. Well, I think it's a characteristic of a testing procedure that extinguishes things in quite lawful ways. Now, about the same time I published on that, I don't remember who, but one or two people tried something and didn't get any results, but they ignored an important part of the theoretical framework I put forward. You had to give feedback to people who had shown some signs of ESP to begin with. If you were doing this with people who didn't show any to begin with, feedback didn't mean anything. These 2 or 3 studies were done with the college sophomore picked at random, I think, and they didn't show anything, which was quite in line with the theory, but totally trivial. Remote viewing came in about this time, and Russell Targ and I used to talk about the importance of feedback before the SRI research even got going. And they gave not immediate feedback in the sense of within a second or so of registering an impression, but immediate in the sense of they tried not to do anything relevant to the possible target in between the person coming up with their impression about the remote location and their being taken to it and actually seeing what it looked like. So that was unscrambled feedback or something like that. And I don't almost never hear people talking about there's always a decline effect in remote viewing. No. The good viewers seem to keep their stuff up for a long time, and they're getting unscrambled feedback. That book is probably still available on the used book market, Learning to Use ESP. The Parapsychology Foundation did a monograph version of it too. And I don't know if they're still able to answer orders for that kind of thing or not. The book was a later version and had a little more detail and stuff. Yeah, that was some of the most important work I did. But when I think about the social dynamics, I was telling all the parapsychologists who'd worked all these years, you've been killing off the stuff you want to study. I don't think people like that. I don't know. But
No, I think I
you and
agree.
that
We spend so much time, and we talked about this the other day a bit, Charlie. We spend so much time trying to redo things that have already been demonstrated, trying to reprove that something exists rather than continuing with our research. And this is where we talked a little bit about the Stockholm syndrome, right? The fact that we feel captive to answering skeptics rather than pursuing our science and
I'll
continuing.
tell you the best proof of ESP that I know of, ignoring all that statistical stuff. It was the use of remote viewing to make money until people got greedy, and the experimenters are part of it, and things went sideways when they got greedy. But the other part of that, which really impresses me, was the SRI research was supported by intelligence gathering agencies of the government. Now, as I understand all agencies in the government, they're always struggling for their budget and they need more. And they're fighting with other ones. To sponsor something like remote viewing was a wonderful way to get called that those nuts are bringing fortune tellers in to waste the government's money. The fact that a whole bunch of these intelligence gathering agencies kept coming back for practical remote viewing studies really impresses me. Now, most of them, they're still classified. They can't tell you the specifics of it. But, you know, I wouldn't come back and take a chance on my reputation being ruined unless I was getting some pretty good intelligence gathering results.
Well, we have Ed May and Joe McMonigal have come and spoken to us numerous times. And Paul Smith has spoken to us repeatedly about the work that they did. And a lot of it, you say a lot of it's still classified, but there's a lot of it available these days. A lot of it's been released.
Yeah.
Mhm. So
What, hey, we've gone on for a long time, haven't we? Have I gotten everybody bored by this point?
not in
No,
the
no,
least bit.
no.
Not in the least bit.
I'm still having fun.
Good.
So we've been talking about dreams. We've been talking about communication between dreams. And I think, Sally, what you're talking about with the Maimonides studies, that was one-way communication, though, into the dreams. So, but there was communication happening. But, Henry Reed came and did some talks, he talked for us, and he's done some writing about training people to communicate to each other within their dreams and have common dreams. And he had some success with it, with some of his work that he was doing. Where we actually did a workshop here where we had people dreaming together towards a certain goal and retrieving the information the next day and having discussions with each other, which seemed to be indicative that there was communication between the dreamers while this is happening. This
Right.
is a different sort of, and then being able to bring it back and speak about it and get their own feedback about what happened. So I think it combines a number of these different topics.
Yeah. You can do that in a very open way of just saying, the bunch of you try to have a shared dream tonight, and that's the extent of your instructions. And they might have one that dreams that are very similar, but you'd worry, well, they all saw that thing on the news and that affected their dreams. But if you would say, and one of you people is going to be given a specific thing to try to experience in their dream and communicate, and that got communicated, I'd be very impressed.
I did experiments
I
in
don't
dream work.
Has anything been done like that?
I've done experiments in a dream workshop where we did a suggestion prior to a sort of a secret suggestion to see if people would dream about it. I would hide the word, and we got a lot of hits that way. So being able to actually, I guess it's sort of well, the word was chosen before they went to sleep. They didn't know it. So it's not necessarily a precognition, but telepathy perhaps. Also, a lot of experiences talking with dream characters seem to be a really good way to get information about dreams and about reality. And with lucid dreaming, it's not that hard to start conversations with dream characters about the fact that they are dream characters. It's not that easy. I have done it a number of times, and their reactions are fascinating. Well, because and you don't want to tell them necessarily that they're dream characters because they think they're real, and it upsets them sometimes. So that kind of communication is available.
Yes.
They get upset. They will ignore you. They will walk away, or they'll debate you. So what is that? How do you be conscious inside a dream and have another consciousness inside your consciousness that has its own thoughts? That doesn't happen with the meat in your brain. There's something else going on there. So
that reminds me of one of the interesting things that happened in my life. Years ago, I was feeling that I needed to do something for more psychological and spiritual development, but I didn't really know what kind of thing to do. I dabbled at various things, but I needed to pursue something in a more disciplined, serious way. And I started having some funny experiences. Every once in a while, for a few seconds, I'd be aware of something happening, maybe some people talking or some images that had nothing to do with me or my life. And like they were going, it was like a radio station suddenly got tuned in for a few seconds and then you tuned away from it or something like that. And it made me wonder, what did that mean? Now I could take it as just, a funny thing that happens with dreams, or maybe I wasn't getting enough sleep or something like that. But I just thought it would be helpful to take it as a way, as a reinforcement that I need to do something more serious and disciplined for getting my own mind in good shape. And I did, and got involved in various spiritual disciplines much more seriously. But yeah, that kind of stuff can come in.
I was reading your blog and I was interested in micro incarnations.
Micro incarnation?
Yes. As
It-
opposed to macro.
Oh, is that? Oh, I remember I wrote a blog post on switching identities, and it was like micro incarnations.
Well,
Something
I have
that's what you're
incidents,
talking
you know,
about.
I have incidents in my life that I feel are micro incarnations, like going through a process, like ordering something from Amazon. It's usually like a whole lifetime to get it done. And I wanted to know if that would be like a micro incarnation.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about it to want to put it in a
Okay.
quotation like that. I mean, the micro incarnation idea was just I was playing with the idea of thinking about things in a certain way. I haven't developed a clear
Okay.
framework to use it well.
I like it. It's very, very good.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah. Oh, somebody's got my blog post up in
There
the
we go.
chat.
Great.
Sure.
So Charlie, you've it's so many fascinating topics. I feel that we could probably continue to go on for another hour or even longer, or have you come back and do this again. It's just so many fascinating things we're talking about here.
That
And
would be fun.
I
Yeah.
think you can tell this is a sophisticated group that
Yeah.
have insight into not only the research aspect, but many people have insight into their own experiential aspects and have thought a lot about how to move forward with things. So it's really valuable to have someone like you come and speak to us and share your ideas with us. I wanted to ask you before we go today, is there something that you want to say that just kind of you want to leave us with a message, something you want us to continue thinking about?
I just want to leave you all excited and you go down your thinking routes. But I will end with one interesting story based on this micro incarnation thing of switching roles to a different state of consciousness or something. Some years ago, I was invited to be a speaker in one of these yearly conferences that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has with various professional scientists. And I felt honored for that to happen. Okay. So my wife and I went to Amherst, Massachusetts. It was being held at the college there. And we were walking over one. Oh, this is the amusing beginning to my story, actually. We were walking over to hear the Dalai Lama give a lecture one night to start this conference off. So walking over from our hotel, and this car pulls up beside us with a couple of young folks in it, a guy and a girl. And they see us walking and other people walking toward the auditorium. And they apparently think there's going to be a concert or something. And they asked me, who's playing tonight? And I told them, the Dalai Lama. And they look at me. And I thought, they don't want to appear to be unhip and they don't know about this man, the Dalai Lama. But yeah, they say thanks and they drive on. Anyway, at one point during this conference, the Dalai Lama wasn't there some of the time. He had to go off to handle affairs of state or whatever sort of things go on. And there have been a number of interesting talks. And this day, I was slated to give a talk on the nature of enlightenment. And I went up to the podium, and the Dalai Lama was sitting behind me on the stage, and I was translating for him. And I thought, I'm going to stand up here in front of the Dalai Lama and talk about enlightenment. And I split into several selves. And I don't know whether I alternated between them rapidly or they all manifested at once. Okay. One was a 14-year-old kid from New Jersey. That was me, who was saying, I'm here with the Dalai Lama. That's unbelievable. And the second part of me was saying, the second part of me was saying, you have the nerve to speak about enlightenment even tiny micro enlightenment maybe in front of the Dalai Lama, who might be one of the most authoritative beings on earth to talk about it. And the third one of me was saying, I'm here to give a lecture and I have to make this comprehensible to people. And so I can't pay much attention to these two other selves who are totally freaked out by what's happening here. So I gave my talk, and the Dalai Lama did not throw tomatoes. So even though he was getting interpretation, so I couldn't have said anything too outrageous. But my basic speech was that altered states of consciousness may give us different perspectives on reality, and in that sense, being able to enter an altered state may be an aspect of enlightenment, that you're not stuck in one way of looking at things, at one state of consciousness. It took half an hour to point that out. And the best part of it was the next day when a man came up to me who introduced himself. He was the head of security for Amherst College, and it was his job to wander around and make sure everything went right. Nobody threatened the Dalai Lama or anything. There were people who'd love to assassinate him, of course. And he said he enjoyed my talk, and actually I was the only person who spoke all that weekend who made any sense. Thank you. Very strange experience. Yeah, let's talk again some other time.